70 degrees Celsius. That is how hot the sand of the Egyptian desert can get by midday, hot enough to blister bare skin in seconds. Now walk 200 meters in any direction, and you will hit a river so powerful it can either feed an entire nation for a year or drown every field for 100 kilometers. Fire on one side, flood on the other. No machines, no modern medicine, no weather forecasts. And yet, out of this exact contradiction, a group of ordinary people built a civilization that lasted longer than Rome, longer than any empire that came after it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how they did it. And I promise you, the answer is not what you think. It has almost nothing to do with the pharaohs and almost everything to do with knowledge, quietly passed from elder to child, generation after generation, for 3,000 years. Let's go back to around 2,200 years before the Common Era, near the end of a period historians call the Old Kingdom. This was the era of the Great Pyramids at Giza, already standing for generations by this point, monuments to a level of organization the ancient world had never seen before. But strip away the gold and the god kings for a moment, and picture the people who actually lived under that sun every day. Farmers, men, mothers grinding grain by hand at dawn. Egypt sits inside one of the harshest deserts on the planet. Drop a modern person into that landscape today with nothing, and they would likely be dead within 4 days. The ancient Egyptians did not just survive there, they thrived there for 3,000 years straight. The secret was not luck, it was a river, and everything they learned to do around it. The Nile did not just provide water, it was the reason Egypt existed at all. Every single year, without fail, the river swelled far past its banks in what we now call the annual flood. That water started thousands of kilometers south, in the highlands of modern-day Ethiopia, and by the time it reached Egypt weeks later, it carried a rich black silt that turned dead desert soil into some of the most fertile farmland on Earth. To a people with no concept of tropical monsoon rainfall on the other side of a continent, this flood must have looked like nothing less than divine will. And in every practical sense, it was the line between life and starvation for an entire nation. The Egyptians called this flood season a ket, and they built their entire calendar around it, not months as we know them, but 3 seasons tied directly to the river's behavior. Aket, the flood; Peret, the growing season, once the water pulled back and left behind that black, fertile mud; and Shimu, the harvest, raced against the return of the dry heat. Here is the part that most documentaries skip entirely. Knowing this cycle was not just useful information. It was the single most important survival skill a person could possess, and it was never written down for the average family. There was no printed calendar hanging on a mudbrick wall. This knowledge lived entirely inside people's heads, and it was transferred the only way it could be, through years of a child, stand next to a parent in the field, watching the water rise, watching the color of the soil change, learning to smell in the air before the flood arrived. Families who failed to read these signs correctly did not simply have a bad year. Their children did not survive to have children of their own. Over centuries, this created a population that could predict a Nile flood with startling precision, using nothing but pattern recognition passed hand to hand, without a single calculation on paper. But predicting the flood was only half the danger. The flood itself could kill you. Too much water, and it tore through mudbrick homes, drowned livestock, and swept away entire villages in a single night. Too little water, and the silt never reached the fields, which meant famine, sometimes for years at a stretch. So the Egyptians did something remarkable. Using nothing but hand tools, rope, and an instinctive grasp of gravity and land elevation, they built networks of canals, dikes, and basins to control where that water went, and just as critically, where it did not. This is called basin irrigation, and it let entire communities trap floodwater inside large earthen walls, holding it just long enough to drop its silt, then draining it away before it could rot the fields or breed disease. Maintaining this system during flood season was not optional. It was coordinated, kingdom-wide labor, run by local officials who answered up a chain of command all the way to the pharaoh himself. Water management was not an agricultural chore. It was a matter of national survival, and it sat at the very center of Egyptian political power. Now here is a question worth sitting with for a second. If the heat alone could kill a person in hours, how did an entire civilization function in it every single day for 3,000 years? The answer is not toughness, it is design. Start with clothing. Egyptian dress looks simple in tomb paintings, almost plain, but every choice inside it was a survival decision. Both men and women wore linen, woven from flax that grew thick along the Nile, thanks to that same fertile silt. Linen is light, breathable, and reflects sunlight far better than heavier fabric. It lets air move against the skin, helping sweat evaporate and cool the body, which is exactly what you need when the alternative is heat stroke. Wealthier Egyptians wore linen so fine it was almost see-through. Laborers wore a coarser version. But the underlying engineering never changed. Protect the skin, keep the air moving, bounce back the sun. Then is the hair, or rather, the lack of it. Egyptians of nearly every class shaved their heads and wore wigs instead, made from human hair or plant fiber. That sounds purely cosmetic until you realize what it actually solved. A shaved scalp meant fewer lice and fewer infections in that heat, while the wig itself became a removable layer of sun protection, insulating without trapping heat directly against the skin, the way natural hair would. And that thick black eyeliner you have seen in every Egyptian statue and painting called kohl, made from a mineral called galena, was not just for beauty. It cut down glare from the desert sun, the same reason a modern athlete smears black grease under their eyes, and it likely carried antibacterial properties that helped fight off the eye infections that dust and flies constantly threatened to cause. Architecture solved what clothing couldn't. Ordinary homes were built from mudbrick, Nile mud mixed with straw and baked hard in the sun. It sounds primitive. It is actually brilliant insulation. Thick mudbrick walls soak up heat slowly through the day and release it slowly at night, keeping interiors noticeably cooler at noon and warmer once the desert cold set in after sunset. Windows were kept small and set high, blocking direct sun while letting hot air rise and escape. A passive cooling trick modern architects still study today. And when the walls had finally released the stored heat in the evening, families climbed onto their flat rooftops and slept outside under the stars, turning the hottest part of the house into the coolest place to rest. Water and hydration were treated as something close to sacred, because in that heat, dehydration could kill a healthy adult in under a day, and a child even faster. Villages clustered close to the Nile, or to canals branching off it, so water was never more than a short walk from any home. Egyptians even developed early filtration, storing water in porous clay jars that let a small amount seep through the walls and evaporate, cooling the water inside through the exact same principle some off-grid communities still use today with unglazed clay pots. Diet followed the same flood logic that shaped everything else. Bread and beer were the backbone of the Egyptian table, both made from wheat and barley grown in that same black floodplain soil. That beer was nothing like what you would picture today: thick, nutrient-dense, low in alcohol, and safer to drink than raw Nile water in many cases. Since fermentation killed off bacteria, the river itself could not be trusted to leave out. Bread and beer were so essential that they were used as literal wages, paid directly to the very laborers who built the pyramids. Alongside them came onions, garlic, leeks and lettuce, dates and figs and melons from the fertile soil, fish pulled from the Nile with nets and traps, goats and pigs providing meat, milk, and the muscle to plow the fields. Now let's pause on something almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most quietly impressive part of this entire story: ancient Egyptian wound care. Centuries before anyone on Earth understood what a bacterium was, Egyptian healers were already producing treatments that modern science has since confirmed actually work. They packed open wounds with honey, and we now know honey has genuine antibacterial properties: low moisture content, natural hydrogen peroxide, exactly the environment bacteria cannot survive in. They had no idea why it worked. They just noticed, patiently, over generations, that wounds in honey healed faster and infected less. They mixed it with grease and lint to create some of the earliest dressings in human history. They used willow bark, which contains a compound chemically close to modern aspirin, to treat pain and swelling. And in one of the strangest and most accidentally brilliant treatments in ancient medicine, they applied moldy bread to infected wounds, an early, completely unscientific brush with what we would later call antibiotics. Since certain molds naturally produce compounds that kill bacteria, none of it came from a laboratory. All of it came from watching, remembering, and teaching the next healer what worked. Let's talk about the pyramids for a moment, because the story you have probably heard is wrong. Forget the image of enslaved masses driven by the whip. Archaeological evidence from worker villages near Giza tells a very different story. Most pyramid labor was carried out by crews, fed, housed, and given medical care during their service. Skeletons found in the workers' cemetery show healed broken bones, evidence that injured laborers were treated and allowed to recover, not discarded. These crews even had names, competitive, almost playful titles carved into the stone they moved. And here is the detail that ties everything back to the flood. During Akhet, when the Nile swallowed the farmland and made planting impossible anyway, farmers were redirected straight into pyramid construction, so the nation's labor force was never sitting idle. A 3-month window that could have meant mass unemployment and unrest instead became the engine behind some of the largest structures ever built by human hands. That is not brute force. That is one of the most elegant labor solutions in the ancient world. Religion did real, practical work here too, not just spiritual work. The flood was tied to the god Hapi, and the festivals marking its arrival were not simple celebrations. In a world where most people could not read, these rituals were the delivery system for the single most important survival information of the year, time to the river itself, reaching every person in the kingdom regardless of literacy or status. The concept of Mat, cosmic balance, functioned almost like an early environmental ethic. Farmers who maintained their canals responsibly and respected the planting seasons were living in Mat. Those who mismanaged the land were inviting chaos, and in a very literal sense, they were, because poor land management genuinely could tip a community into famine. And did come. Toward the very end of the Old Kingdom, geological and textual evidence to a run of unusually weak floods, possibly tied to a broader climate shift across the region. Weaker floods meant thinner harvests and eventually real hunger. Egyptian inscriptions from this period describe families struggling to find food at all. Many historians now believe this stretch of failed floods helped trigger the political fragmentation that followed the Old Kingdom, known today as the First Intermediate Period. It is humbling detail. Even the most sophisticated survival system built in the ancient world could still be brought to its knees by a river that simply did not rise high enough 3 years in a row. So how did they catch problems like this before they spiraled completely out of control? Centralized record keeping. Pharaonic officials tracked flood heights, harvest yields, and grain reserves across the entire kingdom on papyrus, using this information to move surplus grain from well-fed regions into areas heading toward shortage. This is one of the earliest documented famine prevention systems in human history, and when it worked, it kept isolated bad years from becoming national disasters. When it eventually broke down under years of consecutive weak floods, the consequences were severe, and they help explain why even a civilization this advanced could still fracture. Let's zoom into something smaller and more human for a moment, because survival here was never just a matter of state policy. It played out inside individual households every single day. Men typically worked the fields, fished the river, or labored on state construction. Women ran the household, wove linen, prepared food, and in plenty of documented cases, worked the fields directly alongside men during planting and harvest. Children were never bystanders. From a very young age, they were folded into the work itself, first scaring birds off newly planted grain, then hauling water, then gradually learning to read the signs of the coming flood by watching insects, birds, and the changing color of the river. By adulthood, nobody had to sit them down and explain how to survive in this environment. They had already lived it, season after season, absorbing an enormous body of knowledge simply by being present. There is also a psychological piece to this story that rarely gets mentioned, and it might be the most human part of all. Living at the mercy of an unpredictable river, where one bad year could mean starvation, put real, constant psychological weight on entire communities. The Egyptians answered that uncertainty not with despair, but with structure. Festivals tied to the farming calendar gave people something to look forward to, built directly into the rhythm of survival itself. Music, storytelling, and shared ritual offered emotional release and reminded every single person that they were not facing this alone. This is a detail modern survival stories almost always leave out. Physical technique alone does not carry a civilization for 3,000 years. A community that holds onto hope and cohesion during hardship will always outlast one that does not. And the Egyptians understood that instinctively, long before anyone had a word for it. Trade filled in what the Nile could not provide on its own. Egypt was fertile, but it lacked quality timber and certain metals, so expeditions pushed south into Nubia for gold and east across the Sinai for copper and turquoise. These trips crossed brutal desert with no guaranteed water along the way, and yet Egyptian traders mapped and memorized reliable water sources across vast stretches of empty land, some of the earliest known desert survival routes on record. That knowledge, exactly where to dig, exactly which plants signaled hidden water nearby, was treated as precious information, guarded and passed down within specific trading families for generations. Here's a question worth pausing on. If the Nile flooded like clockwork most years, why did the Egyptians bother building all this redundancy, the canals, the nilometers, the grain reserves, the trade routes for outside resources? Because most years is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and the Egyptians knew it better than anyone. A civilization that only plans for the good years does not last 3,000 years. It lasts until the first bad one. Every system we've talked about so far, irrigation, food storage, medicine, existed specifically because someone, generations earlier, had lived through a year when the flood failed or came in too high, or a wound turned septic with no honey on hand, and made absolutely sure the next generation would not be caught the same way twice. Redundancy was not paranoia. It was memory built into infrastructure. Even their tools tell this same story of resourcefulness under pressure. With no access yet to iron, Old Kingdom Egyptians built with copper and stone, flint and dolerite doing the heavy work of shaping the massive granite blocks inside the pyramids. Copper, soft, it dulls fast. So Egyptian craftsmen built entire systems around melting worn copper tools down and recasting them, wasting almost nothing in an environment where every scrap of material mattered. Broken pottery became building rubble. Animal bone became needles and fish hooks. Nothing left this economy unused. Here's something that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. The Nile was not just a source of water and food. It was the only real highway Egypt had. There were no roads worth mentioning cutting through that desert, no wheeled carts hauling goods across hundreds of kilometers of sand. Everything of any real weight moved by boat up and down the river, using a wind that conveniently blew south while the current carried you north, which meant you could sail one direction and drift the other, almost as if the geography itself had been built for travel. Egyptian shipbuilders became remarkably skilled at working with limited timber, lashing together planks of imported cedar and local acacia using rope rather than nails, building hulls flexible enough to flex slightly with the river's current instead of cracking under the strain. Grain moved by boat. Limestone and granite for the pyramids moved by boat, floated downstream on barges flood season, when the water sat high enough to bring the stone close to the construction site itself, cutting out an enormous amount of overland hauling that would otherwise have been physically impossible with the tools they had. Even officials and tax collectors traveled the kingdom by river, which meant the entire administrative backbone of Egypt. The system that tracked flood heights and grain reserves and organized labor during a kate depended on this same waterway that also fed and clothed every person living along its banks. Lose the Nile, and you don't just lose water. You lose transportation, communication, and government all at once. Measurement itself became a survival tool in ancient Egypt. And this is where things get genuinely impressive. Officials known as nilometers, structures cut directly into riverbank stone or built as deep wells connected to the river, allowed priests and administrators to measure the exact height of the flood each year, sometimes down to fractions of a cubit. This was not a curiosity. It was an early warning system. A flood measuring too low meant officials could begin preparing for a lean Hans in advance, adjusting tax collection and opening grain reserves before hunger ever became visible in the streets. A flood measuring dangerously high meant villages downstream could be warned to reinforce dikes or evacuate low-lying homes before the water arrived. This information traveled up and down the Nile by boat and by runner, forming a communication network that let a kingdom stretching hundreds of kilometers respond to a single river's mood almost as one coordinated body. Scribes, trained for years in this exact skill, recorded these measurements on papyrus, meads harvested straight out of the Nile marshes, creating some of the oldest continuous environmental records in human history. Data so precise that modern climatologists still study these ancient flood records today to understand long-term shifts in African rainfall patterns. Picture, for a second, one specific evening inside the workers' village near Giza, roughly 4,500 years ago. The sun has just dropped below the horizon, and the mudbrick walls that baked all day are finally starting to release their heat into the cooling night air. A crew leader, maybe someone whose name was something like Nefer, is walking the narrow street between rows of small stone and mudbrick homes, checking on his team after a day spent dragging limestone blocks up a ramp under a merciless sun. Archaeologists digging this exact site found bakeries producing thousands of loaves of bread a day, breweries producing beer by the barrel, and a small cemetery where healed fractures tell us injured workers were not abandoned but treated and given time to recover. This was not a slave camp. It was closer to a small, self-contained industrial town, with its own doctors, its own food supply chain, and its own internal economy, all built specifically to keep a workforce of thousands alive and functioning through years of brutal physical labor. That level of logistical planning, feeding, and medically supporting a workforce this large 4,500 years before modern industry existed is honestly one of the most underrated survival achievements of the entire ancient world. Now, quick question. What do you think was more dangerous to an ordinary Egyptian family, the desert heat, or the animals living right alongside them? The honest answer is the animals, and it is not close. The Nile to two of the deadliest creatures in Africa, the Nile crocodile and the hippopotamus, both responsible for a steady stream of deaths among fishermen, farmers, and anyone who waded too far into the water while washing clothes or filling a jug. Egyptian communities developed real, practical countermeasures around this constant threat. Fishermen worked in pairs, never alone, with one person watching the water while the other worked the nets. Riverside paths were deliberately worn along higher, drier ground wherever possible, keeping distance between daily foot traffic and the reed beds where crocodiles preferred to hide. Even religion adapted to this threat, with the crocodile god Sobek worshipped in part as an attempt to spiritually manage a very real, very physical danger that could not be reasoned with or fully avoided, only respected. Beyond the river, scorpions and venomous snakes posed a constant, quite inside homes and fields, and Egyptian medical texts from this broader era describe treatments for bites and stings using specific plant compounds, alongside protective spells stripped of their religious framing, functioned as memorized first aid instructions, passed down the exact same way as every other piece of critical survival knowledge in this civilization, by mouth, by ritual, and by repetition. Even death in ancient Egypt was approached as a kind of long-term survival planning, and that might sound strange until you understand the logic behind it. Egyptians believed the afterlife was a continuation of physical existence, which meant a person needed real, practical provisions to survive it: food, tools, even servants rendered in small carved figures called shabtai, meant to perform labor on behalf of the deceased in the next world. Preserving the body through mummification was not simply a religious ritual detached from daily life. It grew directly out of the same environmental knowledge that shaped everything else in Egyptian survival culture. Early Egyptians, that bodies buried directly in hot, dry desert sand, away from the moisture of the floodplain, naturally dehydrated and resisted to decay far longer than bodies buried in damp soil closer to the river. That simple observation, made by ordinary people burying in the sand centuries before anyone practiced formal embalming, eventually evolved into the deliberate, technical process of mummification, using natron salt from dry lake beds to draw moisture out of the body artificially, mimicking and improving on what the desert itself had already been doing naturally for generations. It's a remarkable example of how deeply environmental observation shaped even the most sacred parts of Egyptian life, using the same desert that threatened the living to help preserve the dead. When you step back and look at the full picture, the survival story of Old Kingdom Egypt is really a story about knowledge, tested, refined, and carried forward by ordinary people across centuries. Nobody invented basin irrigation in a single afternoon. Nobody discovered honey's healing properties in one lucky guess. These were slow accumulations, built one observation at a time, by people who understood, even without ever saying it out loud, that what they had learned through hard experience was too valuable to let die with them. And that brings us back to where we started. 70 degrees Celsius sand on one side, a river capable of drowning 100 kilometers of farmland on the other. No machines, no forecasts, no modern medicine, and still 3,000 of survival, built entirely on the willingness to watch closely, adapt constantly, and pass every hard-earned lesson down to the next person standing in that same field. Every mudbrick wall angled to catch a breeze, every jar of honey packed into an open wound, every child learning to read the color of the river before they could read a single word. All of it adds up to the same conclusion. The pyramids get all the attention, but they were never the real achievement. The real achievement was a system of knowledge strong enough to outlive individual lifetimes, strong enough to survive famine and flood and the collapse of entire governments, and still come out the other side intact. That is the real secret behind the pyramids, and it has almost nothing to do with the pharaohs carved into their walls. If this story showed you something new about how far human beings can go with but knowledge and each other, hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel, because every week we dig up another ancient civilization's forgotten survival secrets. And I promise you, this is far from the last river that will try to kill an entire nation. Tell us in the comments which ancient civilization we should uncover next, and we will see you there.